So in the last lecture, you learned that sometimes you cannot test a specific functionality using integration tests. That's why in any application, you need both unit and integration tests. They complement each other. For every piece of functionality, you need to make your own judgment and decide what is a better approach to test your code. There is no one size fits all. Sometimes you may prefer to use unit tests, other times you may prefer integration tests. What matters is that you need some kind of test to verify the behavior of your application. So let's go ahead and write a unit test for this function to make sure that if the client sends a valid JSON web token, request.user will be populated with the payload of the JSON web token. So here our test folder. This time we're going to go to our unit tests folder, add a new folder. Let's call that middleware. And here we'll have a test file, auth.test.js. So we start with our describe block, auth middleware. Now here's our test. It should populate request.user with the payload of a valid JSON web token. Okay, so we need a valid JSON web token. For that, we need to import the user class. So we need to require it. We go 3 levels up, get to the models folder, and load the user module. And then use object destructuring to load the user class. So here, we new up a user and generate a valid auth token. That's our token. Now we need to call our auth middleware function. So let's import it on the top, require. Again, we go 3 levels up to the middleware folder and load the auth module. This returns a function. Let's call that auth. So here we need to call auth and pass 3 arguments: request object, response object, and next function. Now we need to mock all of these. So let's create a request object. Now what do we need in this object? Well, let's go back to our middleware. So in this function on line 5, we need to call request.header to read a header. So our mock object should have a method called header. Back to our test file. We set header to jest.function. And here we call mock return value to return our token. So that's our request object. Now, back to our middleware. Assuming that we have a valid token, we'll end up in the try block. Here we'll verify the token, and then we set the user property, and finally we call the next function. So next should also be a mock function. We define next here and set it to jest.function. Also, let's define the response object. Now in this path, in this happy path, we are not working with the response, but we still need to pass it as an argument to the auth function. So after this, we expect request.user to be defined. Now this is a little bit generic, but we're going to come back and revisit it. So let's make sure what we have done so far works. Save, back in the terminal, all tests are passing, beautiful. So let's change this and make it more specific. Before generating this auth token, I want to initialize this user object with 2 properties, ID and isAdmin. These are the properties that we put in the payload of our tokens. So let's create a user object here and set underline ID as well as isAdmin. Now earlier you learned that this underline ID is an object ID. So if we set that to a number, Mongoose is going to ignore that. We need to pass a valid object ID here. So on the top, let's load Mongoose so we can generate a valid object ID. Constant Mongoose, we require Mongoose. Now here, we replace 1 with Mongoose, the types, user.object ID. So we have a user object, and then when creating a new instance of this user model, we pass user to initialize it. And finally, we change our expectation. So this request.user should match this user object. Okay, save, back in the terminal. We have a failing test. Let's see what happened. We have a familiar error. So we expected underline ID to be an object ID, which is a complex structure, but what we got was a string. So technically, here, when we create a user object, this ID property is an object ID, but when we decode a JSON web token, we're dealing with a string. So to make sure our expectation passes, we need to convert this to a hexadecimal string. Now let me put these two properties on different lines so you can see clearly. That's better. So back in the terminal, all tests are passing.